When I moved into the old Victorian house at the end of Maple Street, I was brimming with excitement. It had character, history, and an undeniable charm that made me feel like I was stepping into another world. But the glee faded the moment I started to hear the whispers. At first, I chalked it up to the house settling or the creaks of an aging structure, but as night fell, the voices became clearer, almost like someone was having a conversation just beyond the walls, just out of earshot. I decided to investigate one particularly stormy night while the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. With a flashlight in one hand and a determination to dispel any shadows lurking in the corners of imagination, I crouched down, peering under the floorboards of my bedroom, where I noticed a small, dusty gap just big enough to fit my hand. As I pried the rotting wood apart, fighting back my trepidation, I found an old leather-bound diary coated in years of dust and neglect. Its spine creaked in protest as I opened it, and the pages were filled with cramped handwriting. Each bold stroke of ink felt like a spectral finger reaching through time, urging me to read. Flipping through the yellowed pages, it became a chronicle of solitude, heartache, and despair, each entry penned by someone who poured their soul onto paper, and while the earlier notes spoke of mundane days infused with a heavy melancholia, it was the last entry that caught my breath, dated for tomorrow. It simply read, "They're here. I can hear them scratching." My heart thumped wildly in my chest, adrenaline overshadowing any sense of rationality, and I suddenly felt an intense urge to bury the diary back under the floorboards, to pretend for a moment that I had never stumbled upon it. But what I found instead was an insatiable curiosity, the sort that takes hold of your mind and claws at your chest until you give in. I spent the entire night replaying that one line over and over, unable to shake the sensation that I wasn't alone in the house. That the shadows were watching me as I sat there, the air thickening with dread as if the walls themselves were cloaked in secrets. Hours passed, the winds roared outside, yet I remained rooted to the ground, nervous but paralyzed with intrigue. The clock ticked tortuously toward midnight, and I felt something inexplicable shift in the atmosphere, an electrifying tension that promised something dark and terrible was imminent. I found myself clutching the diary, fixated on that last line as I imagined what it must have felt like for the writer, living in the constant shadow of unseen horrors. I resolved that when dawn broke, I would have to return to that cursed book and uncover its mysteries, but with each passing hour, the strange sounds began, an unsettling scratching, like claws against wood, echoed through the house, sending shivers down my spine. It was as if someone, or something, was trying to escape whatever torment had once transpired in that long-ago life. I backed away from the diary and against the wall, anxiety gripping me as I glanced nervously at my door, half expecting to see the pale face of the writer from the pages staring back at me. As the scratching grew louder, louder than my own heartbeat, I suddenly realized the truth, a dark dawning realization that twisted my stomach into knots. Tomorrow, I would witness whatever horror lingered here. The diary had sealed that fate for me. Morning light spilled into my room, banishing the shadows of night and filling me with a false sense of safety, but the dread remained, unshakable, binding, echoing through every creak. The wave of determination crashed over me once again, propelling me to dig through the layers of mystery that shrouded this house. What had that writer encountered? What had they done that made them feel hunted? I picked the diary up with trembling hands and began reading the entries aloud, each syllable seeming to awaken something long silent in the dark corners of the room. As I approached the climax of the tale, the entries shifted from melancholy to panic, detailing encounters with shadows that moved of their own accord, voices that called out in pleading tones before dissolving into eerie silence, and then a final note about a pact made, a price that needed to be paid. The last entry, I had to remind myself it was dated tomorrow, clung to my soul and raised the hair on my arms. I have to let them in. If I don't, they'll take me instead. And in that haunting moment, faint scratching returned, echoing louder than before, and I understood her dread. This diary was a map, a guide to whatever dark entity haunted this house. Goosebumps electrified my skin as my mind reeled. The only thing worse than knowing this house was shared with restless shadows was realizing they'd set their sights on me, a living enigma who had disturbed their ancient slumber. I heard soft dragging sounds now, sharper, closer, crawling beneath the floorboards in a synchronized rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. Panic gripped, I bolted for the door, feeling the unsettling presence behind me urging me to turn around, to look, to listen one last time to the whispers that had snaked into my head. I could almost hear the writer's tortured cries merging with the scratching, "Let me out." But now, as I fled down the stairs and out into the light, my heart pounding with primal fear, I knew I had unleashed something monumental, something that had been bound and rejecting of life for longer than I could comprehend. When I reached the front yard, trembling and gasping for breath, I could hear them rising, furious and hungry, their scratching transformed into frantic claws tearing at the earth, a sound that felt like fury and despair melded into one terrible howl. And for one surreal moment, as I glanced back toward the threshold of that cursed house, rooted in time like a nightmarish sentinel, I swore I saw the reflection of a pale woman in the window, trapped forever within the pages of that diary, forever awaiting a dawn that might never come. As the shadows surged around me in defiance, I realized the horrible truth laid bare: they weren't here for me, they had never wanted me, they were coming for the house, returning to claim what I had unwittingly awakened, while I, mere witness to this dark reunion, could only run from the inevitable reckoning destined to unfold just one day after that last fateful entry.
I used to think I understood the depths of despair, but I was wrong until that fateful night when I truly grasped the weight of a friend's struggle. It started with a simple phone call from Jenna, my childhood friend. We grew up together in a sleepy little town where wild dreams spread like wildfire through the dense woods. But somewhere along the way, life had extinguished those flames for Jenna. She called me that night, her voice trembling, barely a whisper as she confessed that she didn't want to go on anymore. It wasn't the first time we had talked about her feelings of worthlessness. I had tried to help before, but somehow, this time it felt different. An overwhelming wave of concern crashed over me, and my heart raced while I tried to find the right words to pull her back from the edge. I messaged her 100 times, telling her I'd be there in 10 minutes. I raced through the darkened streets under the flickering streetlights that illuminated the way like ghosts guiding me home. When I arrived at her house, it felt as if the air itself had thickened with despair. I knocked frantically on her door, and finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard her footsteps shuffle toward me. In a moment straight out of a nightmare, when the door creaked open, Jenna's face betrayed a haunting emptiness. I wanted to reach for her, to pull her into my arms and promise her everything would be okay, but something stopped me. I saw it in her eyes, the unrelenting weight of her despair, almost palpable in the space between us. I held my breath and stepped into her dimly lit living room, where shadows danced along the walls like specters of her past. We sat on her worn-out couch, where tears streamed down her cheeks, carving paths through her pain, and that's when I noticed the notebook on the coffee table. It looked innocuous, but upon closer inspection, it was filled with words that bled agony. Scribbled lines of self-hate and despair poured from the pages. I felt familiar anger bubbling inside me. Who had made her feel this way? Who or what could have convinced her that she wasn't enough? Unwilling to skim the surface, I probed deeper, asking her to tell me precisely what she felt, what had led her to believe she was worthless. As she spoke, a darkness filled the room. She talked about her job, how unfulfilling it was, and how her friends had drifted away. She spilled out stories of failures, missed opportunities, and a suffocating loneliness that crushed her spirit. Each confession was like a dagger piercing my heart, yet each one seemed to unlock something darker in the corners of her mind. A memory flickered in my mind, something she said during happier times about a necklace she once had, one that her grandmother had given her. Seeing it again ignited a spark of determination within me, and without thinking, I suggested a crazy idea. I jumped up and told her we needed to reclaim that part of her life. We could find a way to unearth her worth in the same way we used to pretend we were adventurers searching for treasure in the woods. I offered her a challenge. We'd spend the night retracing the paths we used to roam as kids, digging for something, anything, that reminded her just how beautiful life could be. For a moment, the flicker of a smile danced within her eyes, and then it was quickly extinguished by the weight of her doubt. She hesitated, practically fighting back the energy that might have been a yes, but eventually relented, taking my hand with a shaky breath. We slipped into the night, armed with nothing but flashlights and a shared sense of purpose. Climbing over the old wooden fence that separated our childhood neighborhood from the woods felt like crossing a threshold into a world we thought we had lost. Shadows whispered around us as we ventured deeper, brushing against branches that bent beneath the weight of the dark. We switched on our flashlights, illuminating familiar paths cloaked in dim light, where we once laughed, played, and dreamed day after day. With every step, I pointed out small memories: the tree where we'd carved our initials, the spot where we had buried our treasure, a shoebox filled with trinkets, letters, and youthful hopes. Each new discovery brought a faint smile to Jenna's face, and I could almost hear the chains of despair loosening, the shadows retreating. However, that darkness had its claws deep in her heart, and no amount of nostalgia seemed enough to clean the wounds. I started to recite bits from our past that I thought would lighten the mood, our summer camp misfit stories, the time we built a fort in the woods and thought it was an impenetrable fortress. Her laughter began to emerge from behind the darkness, that lovely sound that once lit up my world. It was different, fragile but there, and it gave me hope. So, I pressed on, searching for a spark that could ignite her own self-worth, and suddenly, with a loud crack, a branch snapped beneath my feet, and I stumbled into an old clearing we had long forgotten. My flashlight flickered on something shiny half buried under the leaves. My heart raced, perhaps it was a clue to something greater, a symbol of her worth. I knelt down, swept away the debris, and unearthed something that made my breath catch in my throat, a delicate pendant that looked much like the one Jenna had once described. My heart dropped, it was beautiful. I held it up to the moonlight, hoping it would shine as brightly as the spark I felt inside. "Jenna! Look what I found!" I called out, excitement leaking from every pore. She rushed over, eyes wide, her breath taken away. It was more than the necklace, it was a piece of her forgotten self, a confirmation that beauty and worth could spring from the soil of despair. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she reached out to clasp it, disbelief sizzling in her voice. The moment when her fingers brushed against the cold metal was electric. My heart swelled as I watched her eyes dance with the recognition of something she thought was lost forever. The darkness receded, and with every breath she took, it felt as if she was pulling life back into her spirit. It was a turning point. As the night wore on, we talked for hours about her hopes and dreams, the things she wanted from life beyond the shadows that consumed her. I saw a glimpse of the Jenna I had known, the girl who once believed in limitless possibilities. We laughed until our sides ached, and there it was, her worth, blossoming like the first flowers of spring emerging from the cold earth. As dawn approached, we found ourselves at the riverbank, the cool air revitalizing our spirits, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. I turned to her and said, "You are so much more than the darkness that tries to pull you down. You have a light inside you that the world desperately needs." And I meant it, the person staring back at me had so much potential, so much to give, she just needed someone to help guide her back to it. That night, I helped my friends see her worth once more. It wasn't an instantaneous fix, there were still scars and shadows, but she had taken the first and most crucial step towards reclaiming herself. As we walked back home, hand in hand, the weight of despair had transformed into the promise of hope, and I knew that ultimately, the battle was hers. But sometimes, all it takes to awaken someone's buried worth is a reminder of the light that still flickers within them, even during the darkest nights. I never considered myself a bad communicator, but when my girlfriend Lily ended things, reality hit me harder than a punch to the gut. I thought we had it all figured out, but clearly, something wasn't clicking. It wasn't until she packed her things and walked out the door, leaving me with the stinging words "you just never listen" echoing in my mind, that I realized I had to make an effort to change. I stumbled through the initial days of our breakup, drowning my sorrows in binge-watching shows and lofty delusions of winning her back with grand gestures. But as the shock wore off, a twisted curiosity about my failures crept in. I started obsessively retracing our conversations. Texts, late-night talks, all those moments when I thought I was there for her but apparently wasn't. I noticed a pattern. When she opened up, I responded with platitudes or worse, tried to offer solutions instead of listening. It was as if I heard her but didn't really hear her. One night, deep in my rabbit hole of self-reflection, I came across a forum post on an obscure website, titled "How I Learned to Communicate with the Dead." At first, I dismissed it as another incredible hoax, but my morbid curiosity got the better of me. It described a mystical experience involving a one-of-a-kind seance led by a woman named Agnes, who claimed to connect you not just with the deceased but deeper aspects of yourself. It quickly became my obsession. After hours of searching, I found her old shop tucked away in an alley at the edge of town. I hesitated, an uneasy feeling washing over me as I approached the creaky door. Inside, the dim light flickered ominously, and the air was heavy with incense. Agnes was an elderly woman, with wild white hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through me. "You're here for answers," she stated, almost like a revelation. I nodded, feeling foolish yet strangely compelled by her presence. As she prepared for the séance, she filled the room with an eerie calmness that lulled my anxiety. The candles flickered more with each moment, and the air thickened, almost buzzing with anticipation. "To communicate better, we need to quiet the noise within you," She instructed me to focus on my breath, to strip away the clutter of my thoughts, emotions, and insecurities. I closed my eyes and tried. It was a strange mix of calming and chaos, the constant chatter of self-doubt warring against her voice like an undefeated champion. When I opened my eyes again, I saw the candles flickering wildly, shadows dancing wildly across the walls. Agnes held my gaze, and that's when I felt it, a rush of memories, voices, and emotions flooding my mind. The spirit, she said, represented all those moments I had swept aside. It wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense, but a manifestation of my regrets. Around midnight, I felt as if I had transcended time, hanging on to every single word whispered from the echoes of past arguments with Lily, her voice ringing crystal clear in my mind. I felt her pain, her frustration at my indifference. I was reliving every moment I had neglected her feelings. The weight of it all hit me like a freight train, and I found myself pleading out loud, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hurt you. Why didn't I see it?" But Agnes simply smiled knowingly, her gaze unwavering. "You can't change the past, but you can learn from it. Open your heart and mind to others." When the séance ended, and I stumbled out of the shop, the world seemed different. Colors were brighter, sounds were sharper. In that disorienting moment, I realized communication wasn't about the words themselves, it was about truly listening and understanding the emotions behind them. The next day, I sent Lily a text, a simple message asking if she would be open to talking. Surprisingly, she replied almost immediately. We agreed to meet at our favorite cafe, a place filled with bittersweet memories. My palms were sweaty as I sat down with my coffee, the aroma filling my senses. When she arrived, we exchanged tentative smiles. I had rehearsed what to say 1,000 times over, but all that planning felt unnecessary now that I was faced with her. I started by apologizing, not just for the breakup, but for the times I hadn't listened. To my amazement, her eyes softened, she shared her perspective on everything, and I listened. It felt as if I was hearing her for the first time. As our conversation flowed, I realized that she was still the same, but I had changed. I asked her to tell me about her day, her feelings, even her dreams, all the things I had pushed aside in the past. For the first time, I focused solely on her words, absorbing the emotions behind them. It was awkward and difficult at times because trusting each other again felt like a fragile dance. But as we talked, I began to understand the nuances of communication, the subtleties of patience and empathy. When our conversation came to an end, I was left in awe of the progress we made in just one meeting. We didn't rush back into a relationship, but we established a foundation of understanding that hadn't been there before. I realized truly listening was just as important as talking. That night, I reflected on the experience, how a séance had shown me the ghosts of my actions. It wasn't the supernatural that had changed me, it was the realization of my shortcomings. Days turned into weeks, and Lily and I started to rebuild our connection slowly. There were still bumps along the way, misunderstandings that popped up from time to time, but now, instead of deflecting or dodging them, we faced each issue head-on. Each conversation built more trust, we laughed together, cried together, and, most importantly, we learned how to communicate. I embraced that vulnerability, and it became natural to probe deeper, ask more questions, and show genuine interest in her feelings. I learned not to see silence as an enemy to fill with chatter, but as an opportunity to reflect or understand. Months passed, and one evening on a back porch, while watching the sun dip below the horizon, I turned to Lily and said, "I'm grateful for everything, even the tough times. They made me better." She smiled at me softly, those eyes sparkling with a knowing light as she replied, "I think we both learned a lot, didn't we?" And in that moment, I understood that communication was an ongoing journey, not a destination. It was about empathy, listening, and really valuing what each partner brought to the relationship. I never did see Agnes again, but her words lingered, a soft reminder of how I learned to communicate better in my relationships without the need for spirits or seance. There's a ghost of sorts in every relationship, it's just up to us to confront them. Aita forgoing no contact with my manipulative in-laws? I didn't think I would ever get to this point, but here I am, sitting on my couch, staring at my phone with a mix of dread and relief. The decision to go no contact with my in-laws wasn't made lightly, but after years of emotional manipulation and toxic interactions, I finally reached my breaking point. It all started innocently enough when I married my husband, Jake, 5 years ago. I was excited to become part of a new family, but I quickly realized that his parents had a different vision of what that meant. They were charming at first, always smiling and welcoming, but beneath that veneer lay a web of control and expectations that would soon entrap me. It began with subtle comments about how I should dress or how I should decorate my home. They would criticize my cooking or my approach to parenting, suggesting that I was not good enough for their son. I tried to brush it off, thinking they meant well, but it became increasingly clear that they thrived on criticism and guilt. Their behavior escalated when I became pregnant with our first child. Suddenly, my body was no longer my own. It was a topic of discussion at family gatherings. "Are you really going to eat that?" they would ask, scrutinizing my choices. "You should be more mindful of what you put into your body for the baby." I felt suffocated by their opinions, and every interaction felt like a test of my worthiness as a mother. The real tipping point came when our son was born. Jake and I were ecstatic, but my in-laws turned what should have been a joyous occasion into a power struggle. They insisted on being present in the delivery room, which made me uncomfortable. I thought it was a private moment meant for my husband and me, but they argued that they had a right to be there since they were family. Jake, caught between his loyalties, ultimately sided with them. The birth itself was overwhelming, and when my son finally arrived, my in-laws invaded the room like a storm, demanding to hold him and take pictures. I remember feeling a wave of resentment wash over me as they fawned over him while I lay exhausted in bed. Their behavior didn't stop there. They insisted on choosing our son's name, stating that it was a family tradition to honor a relative. They even created a family tree, tracing their lineage and inserting our son's name in the middle, as if it were their right. I felt completely powerless, and every time I voiced my concerns to Jake, he brushed them aside, insisting that they were just excited grandparents. I began to feel like a stranger in my own home, and the emotional manipulation reached a boiling point during my son's first birthday party. I had envisioned a small gathering with close friends and family, but my in-laws took over the planning, inviting their friends and turning it into a lavish affair that felt more like a wedding than a birthday party. When I expressed my desire for a more intimate celebration, they accused me of being ungrateful. I felt trapped, and when the day finally arrived, I could barely enjoy it. I stood on the sidelines as they played host, taking charge of every aspect of the event while I struggled to keep my composure. After that day, I realized I couldn't continue living like this. I felt suffocated by their expectations and constantly judged by their standards. Jake didn't see the damage being done to our relationship, and every time I tried to explain my feelings, he dismissed my concerns, telling me I was overreacting. I knew I had to make a choice, and that's when I decided to go no contact with my in-laws. It wasn't an easy decision. I felt guilty for cutting them off, but I knew it was necessary for my mental health. I wrote a letter to them, explaining my feelings and the reasons for my decision. I expressed my love for Jake and our son but made it clear that their behavior was unacceptable. I sent the letter and braced myself for the fallout. When I told Jake what I had done, he was furious. He accused me of tearing our family apart and being selfish. "They're my parents. You can't just erase them from our lives," he yelled, and I felt the weight of his disappointment crashing down on me. I tried to explain my side, but he was too angry to listen. Days turned into weeks, and the silence was deafening. I felt a mix of relief and guilt, but I was finally able to breathe again. I focused on rebuilding my relationship with Jake, but the tension lingered. Eventually, Jake's parents began reaching out through texts and emails, trying to manipulate the situation further. They claimed to be devastated and heartbroken, pleading for a chance to talk. I ignored their messages, knowing that engaging with them would only drag me back into the toxicity I had fought so hard to escape. It was then that I realized how deeply ingrained their influence was in our lives. Jake began to withdraw, spending more time at his parents' house and less with me and our son. It felt like a betrayal, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was choosing them over us. One evening, after another heated argument about my in-laws, Jake came home late. He reeked of alcohol and sadness, and I could see the weight of his guilt etched on his face. "I just don't understand how you could do this," he said, tears welling in his eyes. "They're my family." I felt my heart break for him, but I also felt an overwhelming sense of anger for how he had failed to protect me. "You're choosing them over our family," I replied, my voice trembling. "You don't see how toxic they are." In that moment, I realized we were at a crossroads. I loved him, but I couldn't continue living in a situation where my mental health was compromised. I made the tough decision to give him an ultimatum. You need to choose, Jake. It's either me and our son or them. His face twisted in anguish as he realized the gravity of the situation. He took a step back, visibly shaken by my words. I can't do that, he whispered, his voice cracking. They're my parents. I felt like my heart was shattering, knowing that he was unable to see the toxicity that had infiltrated our lives. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in our home grew unbearable. I focused on my son, pouring my love into him while Jake remained distant, torn between his parents and his family. Eventually, the breaking point came during a family gathering at my sister's house. Jake's parents showed up uninvited, determined to make their presence known. I felt my heart race as I watched them waltz into the party, their smiles wide and fake. They immediately began taking charge, asking my sister questions about the decorations and planning the menu without so much as a hello to me. I felt my blood boil as they ignored my existence, and when they pulled my son away to show him off to their friends, I snapped. Excuse me, I said, my voice trembling with anger. Can you please give me back my son? The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to me. Jake's parents looked shocked, their smiles fading as they processed my words. He's not your prop to show off, I continued, my voice rising. He's my son. The tension was palpable as my sister tried to defuse the situation, but I felt a rush of liberation. I was no longer the silent victim, I was reclaiming my voice. Jake stepped in, his expression a mix of anger and embarrassment. What are you doing? He hissed. This isn't the time or place. No, Jake. This is exactly the time. I replied, my heart racing. I'm done playing nice. Your parents are manipulative, and I refuse to let them dictate our lives any longer. The argument escalated, and it felt like a dam had finally broken. I didn't hold back, laying bare all the resentment I had been holding inside. I spoke about how their behavior had affected me and how their constant manipulation had put a strain on our marriage. I could see the shock on everyone's faces, including Jake's. He looked torn, caught between defending his parents and protecting me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jake's parents retreated, their smiles replaced by scowls. They left the party in a huff, and I felt a strange sense of victory. I had finally stood up for myself, but it came at a price. The aftermath was brutal. Jake was furious and hurt, and our relationship became strained. I felt like I had taken a bold step for my mental health, but it had shattered the fragile bond we had built over the years. You didn't have to do that, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You could have just let it go. I couldn't let it go anymore, Jake. I needed you to see how toxic they are, I replied, my heart aching. But I knew he was still blinded by his loyalty to them, and the gulf between us grew wider. I started to question my decision to go no contact. Was I wrong for wanting to protect myself? Had I destroyed my family in the process? As days turned into weeks, I found solace in the support of my friends and sister, who reassured me that I had made the right choice. They reminded me of the emotional toll my in-laws had taken on my mental health. I began to rebuild my life, focusing on my son and my own well-being, but the pain of losing Jake lingered like a shadow. Eventually, I reached out to a therapist who helped me process my feelings of guilt and anger. I began to understand that going no contact wasn't a punishment, it was a necessary step. I never thought I'd find my way back to writing, it had always been my escape, my sanctuary, until life dug its claws in, and I let it slip away. A dull ache settled in my chest, a feeling of irrelevance that gnawed at my mind like a ravenous creature. I spent years buried in the monotonous grind of a 9-to-5 job, swallowing my dreams as I packed away the remnants of my creativity into an old cardboard box labeled past. Until one evening last fall, the world around me turned dark and overcast, heavy with the threat of an impending storm. I was mindlessly scrolling through my phone, and then, in the depths of a rabbit hole filled with nostalgia, I stumbled upon an old blog I had created back in college, a place where I once poured my heart into stories that felt so alive. With shaky fingers, I tapped the screen, and the words came rushing back. I read through my posts, laughing at the innocence of my youthful ambition, but at the same time, I felt this pulse of yearning, this whisper that grew louder with each word. That night I decided to dig deeper, to open the box, searching for the faded notebook where I once scribbled ideas and dreams. As I unfolded the tattered pages, an unfamiliar scent floated in the air, like old parchment and nostalgia, and I was transported back to those late-night writing sessions fueled by coffee and unfiltered creativity. But something was different this time. An unsettling energy crackled just beneath the surface, as if my old muses were waking from slumber and stretching their limbs. I couldn't shake the sensation that someone, or something, was watching me, lingering just beyond the edges of my vision. Dismissing it as a figment of my imagination, I pored over my words once again, each story pulling me deeper into an abyss I hadn't realized was hiding within me. 2 nights later, inspired by that spark, I sat down at my dusty desk, jotting down a story I had always wanted to tell. Words poured out with a fervor, a manic drive I hadn't experienced in years. Yet, as I typed, the air in the room thickened, and shadows danced at the corners of my vision, playing tricks on my mind. At first, I brushed it off as fatigue, but then I noticed the whispers. A soft, almost imperceptible murmur, echoing my thoughts, guiding my fingers across the keyboard to places I hadn't intended to go. It was exhilarating and terrifying. As each night passed, I felt compelled to write more, the words flowing like an unending river, but with every tale I created, the whispers grew bolder, more insistent. They began suggesting plot twists, characters whose endings were not theirs to choose, twisting my stories into something darker. I pushed back, thinking perhaps that was the true culmination of my creativity, having my plots veer into the surreal. Yet nothing could prepare me for the night I realized this wasn't just a benign inspiration, my stories were alive. One evening, I had just finished a particularly twisted tale about a writer who uncovers a sinister secret in the very pages of his manuscript. With a satisfied sigh, I leaned back, only for my heart to plummet as I heard my own story come to life around me. The room dimmed, the shadows deepened, and an icy chill swept through the air. Before I could register the change, my laptop's screen flickered, displaying words that were not my own, a story unfolding in real time that felt so painfully familiar. It was as though the very fabric of reality was being warped by my own desires and fears, morphed into a narrative I didn't control. Trying to remain rational, I convinced myself it was my imagination running wild, but when the whispers turned to voices, clear and malicious in their glee, the illusion shattered. Panic surged through me. I pushed the laptop away, heart racing, but the voices followed, pasting themselves against my thoughts, forcing images of my fears, my insecurities, promising that I'd never escape the stories I had dared to tell. That night, sleep eluded me, and the shadows grew. I became obsessed, drawn deeper into the labyrinth of my own mind, fighting the voices that seemed to intertwine with the very essence of my being. I reached a breaking point, desperate to silence the chaos swirling around me, so I decided to confront it. I locked myself indoors, refusing to leave until I sought the truth. As I clenched my pen, my heart pounded louder in my chest, a steady rhythm matching the furious scratching of ink against paper. I wrote, weaving together every terrifying experience, every nightmare into one final story, hoping it would exorcise the demons haunting me. I saw shadows growing tall and dark, whispering lines that echoed back through the pages unopened and unseen, my story revealing its twisted love for chaos. And just as I penned the last line, the room dropped into silence, that suffocating, terrifying silence that allowed room for dread to creep back in. My heart pounded as I looked around, hoping to feel the release I sought, but instead, I felt the walls tighten around me. Words scrawled across my unfinished manuscript, racing faster than I could comprehend, forcing me to relive my own creations as they blossomed into terrifying beasts. I remember thinking, I have to stop. But I couldn't. My pen moved faster, the stories consuming me. Each character I created was birthed from the darkest corners of my mind only to turn against me. I realized then, with a sickening jolt of understanding, that I was no longer the author. I had become a mere vessel in this narrative woven from my own despair. They were coming for me. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the laughter, horrifying, echoing laughter that bounced off the walls, cold and taunting, as I succumbed to the very stories I dared to tell. I don't know how long I've been trapped in this nightmare, the line between reality and fiction blurring until all that remained were the voices of my characters, all too alive, feasting on my words, and all the while illuminating the path for a writer yet to discover their own tale. So, here I am, sharing the echoes of my story, hoping someone out there will hear my warning. Rediscovering your passion can lead you to places you never wished to visit. When you let the words take control, they might just remind you how to write your own end. When I tried to mediate a dispute between friends, I didn't expect it to shatter the very foundation of my reality. Let me explain. For years, I watched my friends, Alex and Sarah, build an unshakable bond, one that many would envy. They were inseparable, always sharing laughter, surviving heartbreaks together, and dreaming about the future. But like any relationship, cracks began to form. It started with a simple disagreement over an inside joke, something trivial that should have been resolved over a quick phone call, yet spiraled into a rift that grew wider with each passing day. As weeks turned into months, I found myself caught in the middle, going to one side and then the other, trying to apply the soothing balm of reason. You have to talk it out, I urged them both. Friendship is too valuable to crumble over misunderstandings. They seemed to listen, but every time I thought they were closing the gap, something new would come up, and that rift would gurgle back to life. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I arranged a gathering at my place and invited them both under the guise of a game night. I figured a relaxed atmosphere would help them remember what they enjoyed about each other, how friendship can sometimes need a little grease to keep from rusting over. I spent hours preparing snacks, arranging chairs in a circle, and setting up a cheerful ambience that I hoped would encourage connection instead of conflict. As the appointed hour drew near, my heart raced. I wanted so badly to see them laughing together again, their shared joy a testament to the strength of their bond. The doorbell finally rang, and I welcomed Alex, his face a storm cloud shadowed by unease. "Hey, man," he said awkwardly, glancing around as if expecting Sarah to emerge from the shadows. Moments later, Sarah arrived, her eyes cool and collected, but the tension crackling around her felt almost palpable. I tried to break the ice, cracking jokes and hoping to elicit a few smiles, but the atmosphere remained frigid. After a brief round of board games that lasted just long enough to convince them that we were having fun, I could see their patience waning. I called for a break and led them into the living room, where the coffee table bore the remnants of snacks. In that still moment, I summoned all my courage. "We need to talk, the three of us," I said, my voice steady but my heart quickening. They exchanged glances, defensive, hesitant, and recognizing their silent agreement to avoid confrontation. "Why don't we discuss what happened?" I ventured, feeling my palms sweat. "It's time to clear the air." For a moment, silence draped over us, only interrupted by the soft ticking of the wall clock, each tick like a pulse, reminding me that time was running out. And then, something shifted in the air. I didn't notice it at first, but it was as if the room grew dimmer, shadows stretching longer, and then I heard it, a sound, like a whisper carried on a cold draft. A voice I couldn't identify, but it chilled me to the bone. "Stop," it seemed to hiss. I jerked my head toward the windows, expecting to see the streetlights flickering outside. Nothing. I brushed it off as a trick of the mind, too preoccupied with Alex's sudden flare of anger as he threw out accusations and defended his position on the joke that had started their feud. Sarah countered back, her voice rising, and suddenly we were engulfed in a vortex of tension. My attempts to interject fell flat, muffled by their escalating emotions. And then it spoke again, louder, more insistent. "Stop this." I froze, glancing at both of them as they continued, lost in the heat of their argument, oblivious to the presence looming over us. That's when I noticed the shadows, creeping like tendrils across the walls, seeming to pulse with an energy all their own. My heart dropped. I dared not reveal my fear, my instincts screaming at me to end this confrontation, but I had invited them over to find resolution, not fear. And just when I opened my mouth to intervene, a whisper slithered right into my ear, like icy fingers trailing down my skin. "You shouldn't have done this," it warned. Panic seized me, but I couldn't let it show. I had to focus on Alex and Sarah. Just then, Sarah's voice took on an otherworldly resonance, a deep, echoing timbre that made my skin crawl. "You think you can fix this?" She spat, her eyes wide with an intensity I had never seen before. "You think your little game nights can patch everything? You have no idea what's at stake." I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Their forms blurred, flickering as though the very fabric of reality was fraying around us. Shadows began swirling, absorbing the light, and suddenly, the warmth of the room turned to a bone-chilling cold. "Get out," Alex barked, the voice now layered with a different timbre, something sinister brewing beneath his familiar facade. "You have no power here." I stumbled backward, caught between two friends who were no longer recognizable, their faces distorting, contorting into grotesque masks devoid of the love and laughter that had once filled the room. I turned to flee, but something tugged at my leg, a dark mass rising from the floor, wrapping around my ankles, constricting like a vice. You wanted to meddle, it hissed, echoing the voices of my friends. Now you will pay the price. I fought against the dark tendrils wrapping tighter, dragging me down, and the last thing I saw was Sarah's face, twisting into a snarl, her eyes glowing, an abyss where warmth used to be. I awoke hours later in my living room, the game night set up all but a memory. The shadows were gone, the atmosphere returned to a mundane reality, but my heart thudded against my ribs in a rhythm of dread. I picked up my phone, hoping to reach out to Alex and Sarah, but I noticed their numbers were gone. Deleted. Panic coursed through me like ice water, my fingers trembled as I scrolled through messages, memories of countless nights shared, but they had all vanished. They were wiped from existence, as if they had never been. I ran out of my apartment, fear propelling me forward into the dimly lit streets, searching, hoping to find a familiar face. I knocked on doors, asking neighbors if they knew where Alex and Sarah lived, but their faces twisted with confusion, they had never heard of them. I fumbled through memories, piecing together fragments, but it was akin to chasing shadows. Hours turned to days, and I found myself grappling with an empty space where friendship once thrived. The laughter, the shared wisdom, the inside jokes, all obliterated by a dispute I never intended to provoke. Something beyond my understanding had taken them, and I was left to bear the burden of my mediating mistake. Now I wander aimlessly, seeking answers in whispers of the dark, dreading the day when I will be pulled into the void that consumed everything I held dear. So heed my warning if you ever find yourself trying to mediate a dispute between friends. Sometimes, the shadows listening behind you are waiting for an invitation. They are all too eager to rip apart the bonds you cherish, to take what you love and twist it into something unrecognizable. Remember, not all disputes should be meddled in, sometimes the cost is far too high.
Every year, the small town of Eldridge celebrates an autumn festival, a time when the air turns crisp and the leaves burnish into fiery reds and golds, but here's the kicker, no one ever remembers it afterward. I've lived here my whole life, and each festival slips through the town's collective memory like grains of sand. The festival starts on a Friday evening, and residents flock to the park. There's live music, food vendors, games, and laughter hanging in the air like the smell of caramel apples. It all feels magical, but the following week, when Monday rolls around, the festival fades from conversation, like it never happened at all. The locals share vague, dreamlike memories. Didn't we have a festival last week? Someone might ask at the diner, only to be met with puzzled stares. It's unsettling, and I've spent years trying to piece together why everyone seems to slip into a kind of amnesia after the festivities. My curiosity piqued as I overheard whispers about an old legend surrounding the festival, a pact made by the town's founders with something ancient and otherworldly that lurked beyond the woods, and as part of the agreement, the townsfolk would have their one night of joy annually, but at a cost, a price paid in memory. My investigations led me to an old library, where I stumbled upon dusty tomes that spoke of Eldridge in hushed tones, warnings about a shadow that watches, thriving on the joy of the festival, a creature that feasts on memory. I spent nights combing through the archives until I found mentions of sightings, a figure at the edge of the woods during the festival, an ethereal silhouette that flickered like a candle in the wind. The story twisted in my mind like a gnarled root, it felt all too real. I decided this year would be different. I would stay awake, armed with a camera and a notepad, determined to capture whatever the others seemed to forget. When festival night arrived, I parked my car a mile from the park and made my way through the woods, listening to laughter that echoed in the distance, feeling my heart beat loudly as the festivities pulsed like a living thing. I found a hidden spot behind a large sycamore where I could watch without being seen. The festivities swelled as the sun dipped below the horizon, illuminating the crowd with golden light, but as the shadows stretched, a heaviness settled over me. I could see families twirling, hear the shouts of children, but it all had a distant quality, like a dream I was not a part of, and deep down, I felt the gnawing fear, the fear of being forgotten. When the music reached a fevered pitch and fireworks exploded in the night sky, I gripped my camera tightly, my heart racing as I scanned the perimeter, hoping to catch a glimpse of the entity that haunted my thoughts. And then I saw it, a fleeting shape darting between trees, not quite human, not quite anything I could describe, a silhouette caught between this world and the next. My breath hitched as I focused my lens, and it felt as if time slowed. The figure turned its head toward me, its eyes just glowing orbs in the twilight, and in that moment, a wave of dread washed over me. My instincts screamed at me to flee, but I was frozen, pinned by a gaze that felt older than the town itself. The laughter around me dulled, becoming muffled, and I realized the people were either mirroring my fear or were oblivious to the creature looming just outside the festival's glow. In a moment that felt like hours, I clicked the shutter, capturing the fleeting specter before it vanished into the darkness, and as I did, a low rumbling sound rippled through the air, resonating in my bones. The crowd's joy turned dissonant, laughter replaced by an eerie harmony that echoed through the trees, a chorus of forgotten souls. Panicked, I backed away and stumbled, and just as I turned to flee, the air thickened, and a voice, both alluring and terrifying, whispered my name. I ran blindly through the woods, branches clawing at my limbs, the festival's lights fading behind me, and with each step I took, that sinister voice taunted me, reminding me that this was my debt, a payment for witnessing what shouldn't be seen. Breathless and terrified, I burst through the tree line, collapsing into the parking lot, and I was met with puzzled faces, happy laughter, and the hum of celebration. The festival was still alive, yet it felt like a cruel joke. They all seemed to forget what had just transpired. I raised my camera, desperate to show them the proof, only to find it irreparably corrupted, just static where the image of the shadow had been stored. I wanted to scream, to shake them from their trance, but their smiles were vacant, their minds blissfully unaware. As I walked towards my car, I felt a weight pressing down on me, the realization that the town was cursed to relive a moment of joy while sacrificing pieces of itself year after year, and that I was now part of that pattern, an unwilling keeper of a memory others would never know. I got home that night, my heart racing, only to find myself sitting on the edge of my bed, pen in hand but unable to jot down my thoughts. It was as if my mind had betrayed me. I glanced at the clock, and with horror, I realized I was back in the moment before the festival began, and the memory of my encounter slipped like water through my fingers, erasing my own past in the process. As I stared blankly into the mirror, I could almost hear the sound of fading laughter in the distance, knowing I had stumbled upon a truth that would now forever lie unspoken, lost to the winds of Eldridge, a prisoner of the festival that would never be remembered, just another year in the never-ending cycle of delight and despair.
I regret ignoring my gut feeling, a life-altering mistake. I regret ignoring my gut feeling, a life-altering mistake. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when everything changed, but the truth is, it all began with a feeling I couldn't shake. The morning had started like any other, sunlight spilling through my curtains, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafting through the kitchen, and the usual chaos of getting ready for work. But beneath the normalcy, there was something gnawing at me, a heaviness in the pit of my stomach that I couldn't quite explain. It was the kind of unease that makes your skin prickle and your heart race without reason, but I brushed it off as nothing more than leftover anxiety from a stressful week. As I drove to work, the feeling only intensified. I found myself checking my rearview mirror obsessively, half expecting to see a shadowy figure following me. My hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel, and I had to consciously remind myself to breathe. The unease stayed with me all through my morning meetings, making my thoughts scatter and my words stumble. My coworker Sarah noticed, her brows knitting together in concern. "You all right?" she asked, her voice gentle. I forced a smile and waved her off. "Yeah, just a weird feeling," I said, laughing awkwardly. She didn't look convinced, but she let it drop, and I wished I hadn't been so dismissive. By lunchtime, the unease had become a full-blown sense of dread. Every fiber of my being screamed that something was wrong, that I needed to get out of the office, away from something. But again, I ignored it. Rationality won out. What could possibly be wrong in the middle of the day, in the middle of a bustling city? Still, I couldn't bring myself to eat, the idea of food turning my stomach. I spent my lunch break staring out the window, watching people go about their lives, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. When my phone buzzed with a text from my mom, asking if I wanted to come by for dinner, I felt a pang of relief. Maybe some family time would calm me down. I promised her I'd be there by 6. The afternoon dragged on, my gut twisting tighter with each passing hour. It wasn't until the drive home that things truly spiraled out of control. Traffic was heavy, the kind of crawl that made every minute feel like an eternity. I was gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, the oppressive weight in my chest making it hard to breathe. Then, up ahead, I saw the flashing red and blue lights of a police blockade. My heart plummeted as I inched closer, my worst fears materializing before my eyes. A massive accident had occurred, a tangle of crushed metal and shattered glass, and as I strained to see what had happened, the feeling in my gut twisted into a sickening realization. It was a familiar car, crushed beyond recognition, the license plate barely visible but unmistakable. It was my mom's car. Panic washed over me in waves, my hands trembling so violently that I could barely keep the car steady. My ears were ringing, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. I pulled over to the side of the road, stumbling out of my car as if in a daze. My knees gave out, and I sank onto the gravel, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Emergency responders were everywhere, their voices muffled and distant, like I was hearing them through a wall of water. I managed to ask one of them, a paramedic with kind but weary eyes, if there had been any survivors. He looked at me, and the pity in his eyes told me everything I needed to know before he even opened his mouth. "I'm sorry," he said, and those two words shattered something deep inside me. My mom, the woman who had raised me, who had just texted me hours ago, was gone. The world blurred as grief consumed me, but beneath the sorrow was a burning sense of guilt. I had known, somehow. That gut feeling, the one I had brushed off as anxiety, had been a warning. A warning I hadn't heeded. If I had left work early, if I had listened, maybe I could have stopped her, maybe I could have saved her. The what-ifs and could-haves tormented me, an endless loop of regret. The days that followed were a blur of condolences and funeral arrangements. Friends and family gathered, their sorrowful expressions and whispered words blending into a cacophony of grief. I went through the motions, numb and hollow, but the feeling in my gut never went away. It stayed with me, a constant reminder of the price of ignoring my instincts. I stopped sleeping, haunted by dreams where my mom's face was just out of reach, her voice echoing in the darkness. "Why didn't you listen?" she asked, over and over, until I woke up gasping for air. The worst part was the moments when I almost forgot, when I'd pick up my phone to text her or walk into her house expecting to see her smile. The emptiness that followed those moments was crushing. Weeks passed, and I withdrew from everyone. Work became a distant memory, my once orderly life descending into chaos. I spent hours researching gut feelings, reading about the science behind intuition and how the brain processes danger. It was a futile attempt to make sense of what had happened, to understand why I hadn't listened to the one thing that could have saved her. One night, unable to bear the silence of my apartment any longer, I took a drive. The same route I had taken the day of the accident. The road was dark and empty, the memories lurking in every shadow. I pulled over at the spot where the accident had happened, now marked by a small memorial of flowers and photos left by friends and strangers alike. I got out of the car, the cold night air biting at my skin, and knelt beside the memorial. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. Tears blurred my vision, and for the first time since the accident, I let myself cry. I wept for the loss, the guilt, and the gut feeling I had ignored. As I sat there, something strange happened. The air grew still, and a warmth enveloped me, a presence so familiar it made my heart ache. I closed my eyes, and for a fleeting moment, I could almost feel my mom's hand on my shoulder, her voice whispering, "It's not your fault." The warmth lingered, comforting and bittersweet, and then it was gone, leaving me shivering in the cold once more. But something had shifted. The regret would never leave me, and the guilt would never fully fade, but I realized then that my mom wouldn't want me to be trapped in that cycle of blame. I had made a mistake, one that had cost me dearly, but I was still here. I had to honor her memory by living, by finding a way to forgive myself, even if it felt impossible. As I drove home that night, the feeling in my gut was quiet, not the suffocating dread I had grown used to, but a gentle, guiding presence. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I promised myself that I would never ignore my instincts again, that I would trust the whispers of intuition that had once tried to save me. It wouldn't bring her back, but maybe, just maybe, it could bring me a sense of peace one day.